I'm James Derian. I'm going to be moderating this wonderful panel. You might be a little punch drunk by now. It's the last round. We're going to try to keep it upbeat, exciting, energizing. We're here to discuss what is beyond hybrid warfare. And thanks to the earlier panels, we have a strong sense now of what kind of warfare comes before. And the short answer is a lot. We have proxy, nuclear, conventional, guerrilla war, low-intensity, asymmetrical war, post-cold, post-modern, post-war. These are just quotes from what I've heard today. Virtual, virtuous, cyber war, war on drugs, cancer, and crime, war on terror, war on war, the long war, war without warring. Now, what I hope to get out of this panel, I'm now going to put a marker down, is how many concepts, how many words, how many definitions do we have for peace compared to war? And why is that? So I'm hoping someone considers beyond hybrid war the possibility of peace. Now, we're going to start, we're reshuffling a little bit the deck. We've sort of been reshuffling the deck all along. We have some new people, new faces, new ideas, but we also have some multimedia. So we're going to start with Jairus, who really puts the image into imagination, the razzle into dazzle, the rock into rock and roll. Sorry, Jairus, I just felt like I had to introduce you as a rock man there. Who's going to be presenting a little multimedia to sort of set the tone. And we're going to have the lights out. This is not a terrorist attack. The grid's not going down. This is intentional.
More especially modern wars in which weapons change rapidly, one thing is certain, and this is that no army of 50 years before any date selected would stand a dog's chance against the army existing at that date, not even when composed entirely of Winkle Reeds and Marshall Neys. So said British General J.F.C. Fuller in 1919. Modern warfare followed this progressivist trajectory in which each successive stage of development was to be an irreversible improvement on the stage that preceded it for the first half of the 20th century. Technique and technique were thought to be innovated by the great powers, advanced, then diffused from center to periphery, or actively transferred from center to periphery as dictated by the security and financial interests of European and American metropoles. To quote Waltz, competition produces a tendency towards sameness in competitors. However, the acceleration and intensification of martial globalization, particularly in the spread of technical knowledge, and intensification further amplified by new solidarities from post-colonial to neo-authoritarian, have culminated in a period in which there was and continues to be a precipitous decline in the strategic value of force and a parallel fragmentation and proliferation of collective violence. Several necessary conditions enter into relay of positive feedbacks, resulting in a severe mutation of global warfare, and thus the global order, which has ended up in the presumptive advantage of great powers. We exist in a period of late globalization. By late globalization, I mean a period of renewed ethno-nationalism, wall building, border militarization, authoritarian electoral processes, right and left agendas against market liberalization, declining demand for global supply chains and commercial shipping, the fracturing of the European Union and other regional fora, and a spreading multinational backlash against international institutions like the United Nations, International Criminal Court, all taking place simultaneously with unprecedented numbers of people on the move, drone programs premised on universal jurisdiction, an unregulated global market in arms, a global slave trade eclipsing the height of the Middle Passage, and the first truly non-sovereign currencies with the rise of blockchain platforms such as Bitcoin. However, like the premature declarations at the end of the state and the end of history, globalization will continue. Indeed, could even accelerate with the intensification of processes of deterritorialization and provincialization at one stroke. Reality shows these logical contradictions are not material contradictions. This is because I don't know why it's freezing. This is because contemporary war, as a critical feature of late globalization, is transdimensional. By transdimensional, I mean that the conflicts are extraordinarily local in character, while being connected by intelligence, interest, solidarity, blood, weapon systems, or curiosity to other distant spaces that in turn reinforce and resupply those local conflicts in ways that defy settled definitions of civil wars, proxy wars, or international conflicts. There's also a vexing temporal element in which old fights take on a contemporary significance made possible by real-time constituencies created in vast media-saturated imagined communities that feel the significance of constant Twitter updates, even if some of those constituencies have little or no actual historical connection. The possibility of real-time diasporas and the production of new publics, sometimes temporary, sometimes enduring enough to change electoral outcomes, and strategic interests frustrate our understanding of nationalism, patriotism, and partisanship. The consumption model of old media is transformed by new media platforms to allow forms of direct, non-territorial participation, as in the case of GoFundMe accounts for military equipment, of real-time technical or medical assistance in conflict areas versus digital networks, and the internet, and the vast infrastructures of wires, fiber optic cables, satellites that enable it are the reptilian ganglia of late globalization. The hope for a global democratic public sphere and equitable marketplace have been significantly curtailed by Twitter demagoguery, legions of misogynistic and racist trolls, infrastructure sabotage, DDoS attacks, increasingly geopolitically motivated hacking and cyber warfare. The inner vulnerability of digital networks has created both new capabilities for the mobilization of violence, as well as a target-rich environment for new kinds of attacks. There is no stable high ground when the means of destruction, i.e. networks, is also the access point of vulnerability for attack. Even the lines of enmity are quite blurry, as it is demonstrated in the fights over figures like Edward Snowden and groups like WikiLeaks and Anonymous are the groups and fronts for geopolitical interests such as Russia. Are traditional geopolitical powers simply taking advantage of a naive faith in leak-based transparency? Are these organizations themselves shifting alliances and allegiances? Or are these organizations, do they lack the consistency of interest and leadership to make those determinations in the first place? The blurry lines of capability and enmity is not due to conceptual error or insufficient data. Rather, the blurriness is in the empirical. Therefore, the transversal character of conflict and change make possible new and old wars, not as hybrid, but new syntheses, and a simultaneous difference and real existing multiplicity. I'll skip to the end. So late globalization and the Marshall globalization characteristic of it is a way of describing a global system expanding, deepening, and thickening, but with relations better characterized by inner vulnerability rather than interdependence, and further characterized by heterogeneous fractioning and diversification of forms of destruction rather than the flattening and homogenization of violence that could be deterred or managed. As a result, it should not surprise us, the practices of warfare are taking on the depth of complexity and mutation and unpredictability correspondent to other systemic features of late globalization. Therefore, the recent obsession of the US and parts of NATO and new offsets, so-called third and fourth offsets, which rely on generalized artificial intelligence and automation to collaborate and execute an imagined real-time database of total surveillance, is not likely to reestablish order. Instead, insofar as the compositional character of power and order are changing, attempts to harness or weaponize the new order from paid insurgencies to state hackers is more likely to accelerate the pace of systemic collapse rather than avoid it.
All right, thank you very much. So that got us off with a bang. Let's now go in the order. Arndt, would you like to go next? Is that okay?
Sure. Thank you so much for being here, for the presentation. I have 5 minutes, so I'd like to make 3 points briefly, one on hybrid, one on Russia, and one on NATO. On hybrid, I would like to start off by saying that hybrid threats are not new. Hybrid threats are not new. Countries have always used propaganda, deception, active measures, sabotage. Think of the Trojan horse to destabilize other countries. But what is new is the scale, the speed, and the intensity and the means by which these are carried out today. Hybrid is today a central part of our security landscape. States use hybrid tactics, but also non-state actors such as terrorist groups or criminal gangs. And hybrid campaigns can take different forms and combine different elements, from propaganda to the use of hard military power, or in the words of my boss, the Secretary General of NATO, from tweets to tanks. Second point on Russia. It's not the only country that uses hybrid activities, but from a NATO perspective, it's the main actor today. We saw this very clearly during the illegal annexation of Crimea, where Russia used proxy soldiers, unmarked special forces, intimidation and disinformation to lay a smokescreen of deniability and confusion. It was a very clear example of how blurred the lines between peace and war are today and can be today, and this is probably what we have to get used to for the future. Russia has an agenda, in our view, to diminish Western influence in Europe and to splinter Europe's ability for collective action. Hybrid actions are manifold and never used in the same kind or the same mixture, rather. Sometimes they're aimed at electoral processes, other times at damaging critical infrastructure by cyber means, or other times by using complex propaganda or fake news. What is critical from a NATO point of view is one of the key strengths of hybrid is that it stays underneath the threshold of NATO's Article 5, compensates for relative military weakness, and it is so far rather effective because there seems to be little price attached to it. The response of those countries that are attacked by hybrid measures has been relatively weak and therefore in its effect encouraging. And my third point about NATO, our security landscape is dramatically changing. The clearest example was 2014 with Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, but also ISIL. This is seen as a game changer for NATO, and NATO since then has been changing very much as well. It's much in a process of changing at the moment. It is increasing its collective defense, the 4 battalions in northeastern Europe, but most of all it's adjusting its response to the hybrid challenge, I would say. Part of that is how to relate to Russia. This was defined at the Warsaw Summit with a kind of new double strategy, deterrence and defense on one side and dialogue on the other side. And definitely the dialogue side is extremely important here. We have increased the number of NATO-Russia councils this year, and the agendas are expanding. But on the side of deterrence and defense, there's also a lot to do. One of the aspects here is we have a new division at NATO, which I head. It's Intelligence and Security Division. Its task is to provide better situational awareness, specifically about the whole hybrid spectrum. And in my division, we have created a new branch or unit which is specifically looking at hybrid activities. And by the way, the EU has done exactly the same, and we cooperate very closely with each other. Some other things that we're developing is boosting cyber defenses. Cyber is now a domain of NATO, like land, air, sea, and space, and the political leaders have declared that Article 5 could be invoked as a response to a cyber attack. So that's an important step, I think. And another area is to boost the resilience of our nations against the whole hybrid spectrum, critical infrastructure, and so on. What needs to also be developed in the future, I think, is how to respond to a series attack. Countries are developing hybrid active capabilities. NATO does not intend to do that. NATO is a defensive alliance, but it will be possible to include national hybrid or sovereign effects into a more overarching NATO operational policy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Nice overview. Great overview. Next, Mark.
Well, thanks very much. When we talk about hybrid war, I mean, we're back to the whole issue of quite what it is. There's so much, in my opinion, inaccuracy and mythology about it. There is no such thing as a Russian Gerasimov doctrine. The very concept of hybrid war is exceedingly sort of problematic, not because it doesn't exist, not because we do not see clearly different approaches being used to warfare, but the fact of this notion that it's somehow something new, something dramatic in terms of its tools. And this is, in some respects, developing on from what Arndt said. I mean, precisely, it's old tools that are being applied in a new world. And it's the relationship between those two that is, in fact, so dramatic. Conventional kinetic conflict is now increasingly politically and economically ruinous for all states. I mean, we have a tendency to think, well, just us democratic good guys worry about human life and the others don't. Well, that's not the case. I mean, if one looks at Russia today, Russia is it is an authoritarian kleptocracy, but on the other hand, even it has to worry about casualties. Even it has to think about human lives. One of the reasons why they continue to pretend that there are no Russian troops in the Donbass is not because they think to persuade us. It's because, the last constituency they hope that will still believe them is their own population. Why they have created a pseudo-mercenary unit called Wagner to carry out frontline operations in Syria is precisely in order to maintain the fiction that Russian boys are not fighting and dying on the front line of the conflict there. So, if even authoritarian regimes, which once upon a time in their history not that long ago treated their soldiers more or less as ammunition, just simply to be expended in battle as a price of fighting war, even they're having to think about how their own populations respond. That says something. Likewise, economically, I mean, modern high-tech war is ruinously and ridiculously expensive. If you put together all the Spitfire fighters that flew in the Battle of Britain, in today's money, when it's sort of converted to today's money, that'll come to £261 million. That would almost, maybe, if you're really lucky, buy you 2 F-35B fifth-generation fighter jets. Now, okay, there are all sorts of other instruments, whether it's in drones and so forth, but your full-scale, conventional, techno-war, full-on Tom Clancy conflicts are increasingly, ridiculously expensive. It's one of the reasons why, actually, you'd much rather use them against people who can't fight back. Because after all, at the same time, the world has become increasingly interconnected. We're dealing with open society, even within most authoritarian regimes. The North Koreas of this world are singular. In fact, there is only one. Even China, Russia, Iran, countries that are obviously portrayed as the poster children of the modern authoritarianism, even they actually are interpenetrated by media contacts, by the internet, and increasingly by the need to actually be part of global economies, which bring with them all kinds of other sort of connections and vulnerabilities. People have, and just as nations have, multiple identities, fluid boundaries. And all of this creates more and more points for leverage, and of course, speed of said leverage. And I think this is it's come up several times so far, this question of speed. The world is actually becoming quicker than we know how to respond to it. Now, what this means is that it's become easier and easier to fight wars without declarations and detonations. I mean, I am shamelessly Clausewitzian in seeing war precisely as an extension of politics. War is a way in which you make someone else do something that they don't want to do. And sometimes the best way of doing that is to march an army into their capital and fly your flag over their seat of government. But increasingly, that's not the way. There are so many other ways of doing it. So we need to adapt. We need to absolutely adapt to these increasingly diverse forms of state versus state conflict. Ones in which, as we've heard, the boundaries between war and peace are becoming dangerously meaningless. One of our key challenges on a conceptual level will be precisely to avoid the trap of either over-securitization, where you decide that everything therefore becomes war. That actually media, that's a war-fighting instrument. Education is a war-fighting instrument. And you basically create new Spartas. Or, on the other hand, complacency or despair, when you just simply think, well, we have no idea how to deal with this. Let's stick with what we know. We know tanks. We know how to blow tanks up. We know how to move tanks. So let's stick with those things. We have to find that balance in between, because this is absolutely a wider trend that is taking place. We have this unfortunate concatenation of the fact that what we're talking about is something that has been very, very familiar to humanity. Our notion of war is really quite a modern concept. It comes with the nation state. If you read Machiavelli, I mean, Machiavelli is in many ways often a primer to hybrid war in his own ways. So what we now have is, in effect, an era of pre-modern geopolitics, but being fought out with postmodern weaponry. And that's what we deal with.
Saara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm kind of wearing two hats here. I was just returning to academia after focusing more on activism for the last couple of years. A month ago, I started a new job at the Finnish National Defense University, and I'm working on an Academy of Finland funded project titled Hybrid Terrorizing, developing a new model for the study of global media events of terrorist violence. And it's a multidisciplinary, multi-method project that aims to understand the communicative logics and dynamics of terrorism in the hybrid media system. A lot of media scholars are involved in it. So this is probably why I'm in this panel that has the hybrid in the title. However, I'm going to step out of this state-centric framework that we've been working with, and I'd like to draw upon my activism to make a few points. And I'd also like to add another term to James's list of different wars, the war on women. So as an activist, I'm currently involved in two small projects that address gendered hate on the internet. And the projects are titled The Internet of Hate and Loathing and You've Got Hate Mail. And both of these projects make visible how hate mail is gendered. And that means that it takes particularly nasty forms when it's directed to women, and it aims at silencing women, and often succeeds at that. So why would I bring this gendered hate mail into a conference on insecurity? Why is it a question of security or insecurity? As Ben mentioned in the opening session already, usually critical security scholars have been known to start with this question, who's security and who's insecurity? And this, combined with the classic feminist IR question posed by Cynthia and Lowe repeatedly for the last 30 years, where are the women, opens up a huge terrain we should be paying more attention to. So gendered hate mail essentially makes its targets feel insecure, and this can prevent or limit our participation in society. And I said our because I've gotten my fair share of this hate mail. And I can tell you that it really feels horrible sometimes, and it really shakes my sense of security, or for at least temporarily. It usually passes after a while. So why then is this a question related to hybrid warfare? Fake news have been mentioned here repeatedly. And of course, at least in Finland, the fake news outlets have ties to Russia. They've been known to be funded by Russian sources. And these very same fake news outlets and people associated with them are usually involved in starting hate mail campaigns. And many of these campaigns target women journalists and women who are active online. So it's really kind of a big mess on how to differentiate between different parts of like what's this targeted, directed campaign of hate mail, and which part of it is just random people kind of jumping on board when something is happening, or which is just kind of individuals, you know, doing their own thing. But all of it is kind of combined in this big ideological entanglement of misogyny, racism, xenophobia, anti-feminism, and so on. So why should we really, in this context, care about this? Some trolls on the internet sending nasty threats to women. As Xavier pointed out yesterday, when we talk about femicide, we can't ask half of the population just to bear it or to, you know, go home, not to participate in the public discussions. And I think it's not only on feminists to do something about it, but it's on all of us that we need to pay attention and do something about it so we can truly kind of move beyond hybrid warfare and ultimately maybe live in peace one day. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have Alyn.
Thank you very much. I work with a global network of global cross-party network of legislators working on nuclear risk reduction, non-proliferation and disarmament. So I'm coming more from policy development and implementation, the side of the equation, than policy analysis. But of course, for good policy development and implementation, you need good analysis. So it's very helpful for us as a network to learn from the academics and analysts to help guide what we're doing. So I'm primarily here in the listening mode, but I was very happy for the opportunity to say a few comments anyway about how some of our legislators are looking at these issues. My comments follow quite a lot after the comments of Matt Kronig, in that we're focusing a lot, not primarily, but a lot on the interstate relations and the role of nuclear weapons that still is quite prominent in interstate relations. Matt talked mostly about Russia and the United States and how the nuclear weapons and the policies and the practices are actually still very much current there. But before I came to this conference this morning, I had a quick look at the news for today, and I picked up this interesting report by Associated Press about in Hawaii. Today, they're doing this new test system for nuclear attack. And the governor of Hawaii has said that it's imperative that we're prepared for every disaster, and the warning system is normally for tsunamis and other natural disasters, but now, because in today's world nuclear attack is a threat, we also need that warning there. So they've got a special now, new siren. Perhaps you'll hear it when you return to Hawaii next month. So I think they do it every month, these siren tests. Oh, is it tomorrow they'll do it? Okay. So here is one indication of awareness or perception of a threat. And this one, of course, is with regards to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and US threat and that risk. I've just come from a 2-day conference of young academics, analysts, advocates and activists that was looking at these threats, the risk of nuclear attack, the risk also of war and conflicts that are exacerbated or could spill over because of nuclear weapons programs. The possibility and the policies of preemptive attack against nuclear weapons programs. We saw that with the rationale for the 2003 attack and occupation of Iraq. There's that rationale that's coming up again with regards to North Korea. Should there be a preemptive strike against North Korea to deal with the program? The argument comes up often with regards to Iran. You hear if Iran is heading at any stage towards the nuclear weapons program, that possibility of preemptive attack. So it's not just about the threat of nuclear weapons used, it's also that nuclear weapons programs are creating risks and escalating conflicts. So this group of young academics and analysts were looking at solutions. I think they were answering your challenge, Professor Derian, about not just to look at what the problem is, but what are some ways out of that. And so they were focusing very much on common security approaches, which already are in existence, but perhaps could be better used. diplomacy, and I was very appreciative of the panel yesterday about diplomacy in the quantum age, because it was looking at new ways of using diplomacy. But just if you have a look at the other mechanisms that are in the UN Charter for mediation, arbitration, adjudication, regional measures, etc., how to apply these is effectively is a challenge. And I'm also looking at specific UN initiatives on nuclear risk reduction and disarmament, such as the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which is pretty much just a treaty that non-nuclear states will join, but can that contribute? And then next year will be the first ever UN high-level conference on nuclear disarmament and what contribution that might make. Looking at a couple of those issues, they were looking very much at revisiting no first use, which has been something which some nuclear armed states already subscribe to, India, China, for example. It was something that was discussed during the Obama administration, but didn't get through into US policy. But it's come up again. We heard it in the US Senate Foreign Affairs Committee hearings on the presidential authority of nuclear weapons, and there was some of the members of that committee suggested perhaps that would be a useful approach to take. And it is useful to look at, and I'm very interested in other people's comments, because my understanding is that the primary reasons for not going to no first use policy for the Obama administration or other ones, or previously, was firstly because of the risk of a disarming first strike, and secondly that nuclear weapons should be used as deterrents not just against nuclear weapons but against conventional attack. Both of those arguments could be challenged. One could argue that there is not a possibility of a disarming first strike that would take out all one's nuclear weapon systems. We're talking primarily Russia, US here, because weapons are now deployed on submarines, and you couldn't hit everyone simultaneously. And should nuclear deterrence really be used as a deterrent against conventional attack, or is it more risky and other methods of deterring conventional attack would be better? And so there are a number of initiatives along there, and through the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, the committee there on peace and security, which was chaired by Senator Roger Wicker, Republican senator from the United States, they actually discussed these issues and came out in support of no first use and de-alerting. So that gives some input into it. There's a Marky Lou bill in the US Senate at the moment on restricting first use of nuclear weapons. So I think it's something that's worth looking at as a way of reducing the risks. And finally on diplomacy, and there's a lot can be said, can diplomacy work? I think in Iran, one of the things we saw is successful diplomacy on the Iran deal brought in some of the ideas that were discussed yesterday. This wasn't just a case of getting willing players together and coming up with a deal. But they also, the negotiators also had to manage the public perception and the political perception of the deal. And you saw that in the way that the deal was announced. In order to ensure that the right wing in Iran and the right wing in the United States didn't have further reasons to reject the deal, they had Federica Mogherini from the EU announcing the deal first. So that was a neutral person. And then it was the foreign minister of Iran who announced the deal in Persian, so that really helped for the right wing back in Iran. And then for the US, they came in with both Kerry and then followed up by President Obama. So no side could claim they were having to surrender to the other. They all could claim the upper hand, and that helped provide a successful deal. Coming on to North Korea, very, very difficult, and there's lots of statements coming through that, well, maybe you can't trust the North Koreans, you can't deal with them. But I came across a very interesting article from Catherine Keelow, who's a senior fellow advisor with the Plowshares Foundation, that actually went through the history of the previous deal with North Korea. This was one negotiated through the Clinton administration. And looking at that actually succeeded for a number of years. And it fell apart primarily not just because of North Korea, but because of some misunderstanding between the two, and also from the United States not fulfilling some of its promises. So there's an indication there that there is possibility for diplomacy. And from our parliamentary network, we have found cross-party support in both Japan and South Korea for an idea of a cooperative security framework, a Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone. There's a specific model, 3+3 model. We've also had dialogue with officials from all 6 party countries and also with parliamentarians from North Korea. And there seems to be, this could be the sort of framework that might provide the basis for a diplomatic solution. So I'd give a push again to explore diplomacy using ideas from yesterday for some of these very difficult issues regarding nuclear threats. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm a little bit embarrassed, I must say, because why I love it what Jairus has shown, and I really love it what Mark has said, and what Alyn and Saara said. Fine, fantastic. It is good that there is people who are pushing in this direction. But it seems to me, and now I have to play let me play, I'm not, but let me play the warmonger, the reality is a completely another one. So why the reality will be changed, maybe under the action of all these wonderful ideas, the reality it is that nuclear weapons are there, that even if you find a diplomacy and a security framework in North-West Pacific, in Asia-Pacific, India and North Korea and Pakistan will not give up. So there will be an agreement in which we will have a security arrangement, but a weapon will be there. And Kim Jong-un certainly doesn't say now I'm giving up. But will be an agreement in which you will recognize, as you have done with Iran, with India, so forth, that there are new nuclear ones. 2, it is true that the F-35 costs a lot of money. Yes, it's true, but I wonder why, when Putin has been perceived, and now we keep saying the aggressive Putin, even particularly in this part of the world, has immediately asked to build up forces, even conventional forces. And why? And this is a fact, that the first Wales first and Warsaw Pact, Warsaw Summit reaction was, let's build up conventional forces, bring it forward, because this is the way to deter. And I wonder why the 28th chief head of state, the government of a NATO country, including my country, have said we need to build up defenses, because the level of defenses in NATO are very poor. So the reality is this one. The reality is this one. But even more than that, the reality is that the warfare is a permanent element, you like it or not, of humanity. You may not like it, I don't like it, but it is a permanent element of humanity. And it is perceived that way, because otherwise you wonder why the Polish people are so concerned, or the Baltic people are so concerned, if there is no this reality. 1. 2, warfare is changing, has always changed, it is changing, but this time, maybe we don't even realize, but if we listen to what James Derian has told to us, it is changing in a way that possibly even more dramatic than it was the nuclear bomb, the invention and the use of nuclear bomb. Because the combination of quantum computing applied to artificial intelligence will change completely the way whatever warfare will eventually arise, hopefully not, completely, because it will change. We are not looking here talking of a hybrid of a cyber. We are going beyond. As a matter of fact, in the last study that we have presented to NATO for NATO adaptation, we say from hybrid through cyber to hyperwarfare. And hyperwarfare, what it changed is the dramatic speed by which events will take place, the dramatic speed by which decision will be taken by artificial intelligence, assisting human intelligence. I like sometimes to say not artificial intelligence, but intelligence assistant, hopefully, to human being, because the speed by which you have to take decision will be completely different. So the conventional build-up, it is a reassuring way today, but is not the response to what the warfare will be changing. It is changing in the near future. So it's all nice that F-35 costs a lot, fine, but the reality that Russia is doing, China is doing, India is doing, and the other are doing, and US is doing from this point of view, and now even the European has said we have to go up to build under the etiquette of European defense, but we have to rebuild our defense. So that is the reality. That's the way our political leader perceive the reality, and that's the response they give to provide a sense of security of your people, my people, his people.
I think everyone showed incredible self-discipline, and the reward should be that we open it up to questions. So while you're formulating them, I'm just going to pose one, and it's actually spawned from earlier conversations, and that has to do with technological change and to the extent to which it is driving some of the, it is a driver of what's going to happen beyond hybrid warfare. And in this regard, I think it was Nadine who said that, China's playing the long game, we're playing chess, they're playing Go. And at the moment she said that, I was thinking, Google's DeepMind developed an AI already that can defeat the best Go player in the world in South Korea. That's one sort of provocation I put out there. The second is, to echo what you were saying, is we already have an automated, network-centric sentinel on a very volatile border, and people don't realize this because we focus maybe too much on nuclear weapons. But on the, on the demilitarized zone, Samsung, the people who produce our refrigerators, our televisions, have created basically an automated grenade launcher machine gun that if you flip the switch, it goes on automated mode. So that means it makes its own decision when to start firing. Now that's on the DMZ, highly volatile region. So when you say speed, as well as Marcus said, people who saw the movie last night, Admiral Sabrowski, who's actually the father of network-centric warfare, when I interviewed him, we took this clip out because it was very provocative. I said to him, it's kind of crazy. What you're advocating in network-centric warfare is that we take humans out of the loop, because humans are too slow in decision-making. And he said, absolutely. And that's very, very smart thinking, but it leads to doomsday machines. So those are my provocations. You can address that, or we can throw it open to the floor. Anybody want to comment on that and refute it?
I'll throw in a comment.
Yes, Mark.
I mean, in terms of this whole idea of precisely bringing human beings out of the decision-making loop, we've seen that already. We've seen that on the trading floors with algorithm-driven buying and selling. And we have seen just how disastrous that is on so many levels, not least because it has a tendency, well, firstly, it is gameable, but secondly, exactly, it tends to therefore automatically create spirals. Precisely. So, I mean, I think insofar as we can assume that all these things connect, I mean, I would definitely agree with you that actually there's this tendency to think that the operational tactical requirements of speed ought to supersede the command and control of a human being. I would rather keep an imperfect human being in the loop. But unfortunately, again, that doesn't, you don't shoot first as a result.
Arndt, please.
Just one thought as well. We differentiate between strategic, operational, and tactical levels. I think on the strategic or more political level, the human factor is less in danger than on the tactical level. So it's the NATO Council will still have to take a political decision to enter into a conflict, yes or no. Decide on the mandates. Mandates will have to be endorsed and discussed by parliaments and so on. So there's at least that side of the spectrum which I think is not going to be automated so quickly.
Yes, but the point is absolutely true what you're saying, and I believe I know, you know that I know, because I've been working a lot of time in NATO. But the matter of fact is that when you might find yourself in a situation, and NATO could find yourself in a situation in which the political process needs to be sped up, because otherwise you don't respond. The response will come automatically. Even when we are talking on missile defense already, we're not talking of here hyper warfare, but in classical ballistic missile defense, the military commander that you have charged, you as a politician have charged to provide a defense against ballistic missile, you say, look, if you want me to defend you, look, there will be a situation in which I will ask you, I don't want to exaggerate, but say in half an hour what I have to do. And so therefore, it's not a compensation. Okay, the political process, if the council do the time, takes the time it's taking now, actually we make no decision. The reality will make no political decision. And so either this poor general will switch on the missile or the missile will come to you. And with the hyper-warfare will be even accelerated to that. And by the way, if I could respond to Alvin, it's all nice. And you know also I have been working on no zero in global zero and so forth, so I've been involved in this. But one could argue that the real value of the nuclear weapon is the uncertainty of when you use it or not. That's the real value of deterrence. And therefore, sometimes clarifying the situation when you use it or not might diminish instead of reinforce the deterrence of that nuclear weapon.
We have Jairus, and then I'll give Alyn.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I think we have to start talking about transdimensional warfare rather than either multi-domain or hybrid is the same reason I don't think the strategic, operational, or tactical distinctions hold very well. And the best example of this, recently, James Miller and Richard Fontaine have a good article out about the way that things like disinformation, hacking, and automated systems completely undermine the capacity to make nuclear decisions, even at a strategic level, because you can't trust reality anymore. And so I think one of the problems is that we're trying to develop concepts for incipient technologies, meaning technologies that are just at their very beginnings. But when we have a automated system for determining threats and an automated system for determining targets, and we have information warfare and algorithmic geopolitics that are actually sabotaging all at the same time, and drones that can deploy jump drives to upload viruses even if they're off-network systems, and we see that kind of proliferation, then I think the attempt to think either domains as separate or even strategic and tactical as separate, we're going to have to think transversally, right? Because these things are going to feed back, and they're going to feed back much faster. And so I think it's fine and dandy to have hybrid warfare as sort of a working term now, but my guess is the reason why it will cease to be useful will not be because we didn't get it conceptually right, but because this level of integration, right, the cybernetics behind all of the different trajectories of development fundamentally converge when we start talking about things like machine learning or any of these others, and that's a real operational problem that having those divisions is actually, I think, going to complicate more than it's going to solve.
Alyn, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity for some dialogue. I will respond to some of the wonderful, inspiring, and provocative remarks from
Provoking maybe.
One of those is the comment that warfare will always be with us, which is probably quite true. But that doesn't mean that we have to go to war in every conflict. We have a choice in every conflict of what means we're going to use to address that conflict. And there's a range of choices which are available. And what I'm arguing is we should choose more and more to focus on non-military or non-use of force in conflicts and pay much greater attention to the possibilities of resolving those conflicts through other cooperative security mechanisms, legal means, through negotiation, arbitration, adjudication, regional measures, diplomacy, all these. And that will help to reduce the problems of wars and conflicts and move towards what Mr. Derian was saying is a more greater status of peace. I think if you have a look, for example, President Bush had a choice whether or not to launch a war and occupation of Iraq. President Bush and Prime Minister Blair. They didn't have to. They gave reasons for doing it. The threat of weapons of mass destruction. There was a lot of doubt as to whether they were accurate or not in their threat assessment and that. But they had a choice. Even if there was a greater threat than what some of us believed of weapons of mass destruction still in Iraq, they had a choice of how to respond to that. Similarly, on the Iran situation, there were a lot of calls for a preemptive strike against Iran to stop the uranium enrichment. Obama decided not to do that with military force, although there was the Trojan virus at the beginning of the state, but the primary focus was a diplomatic approach and to try and get diplomacy to work, and that worked. I come from a country, New Zealand, that used to rely very much on nuclear deterrence and the threat of nuclear deterrence and security. that started believing that that was too risky. And this comes to another of your points there, which is that the uncertainty involved in the current nuclear weapons policy, i.e. holding on to the possibility of first use of nuclear weapons, gives that policy a much higher deterrent value, and that's quite true. But it also makes that policy much more risky. And the possibility of a conflict between nuclear armed states with first use policies is much more likely to result in a nuclear exchange by accident or miscalculation than if you didn't have first use policies. And most of the countries in the world have actually gone away from nuclear deterrence and to non-nuclear ways of security. So that's a challenge to those who still hold on to nuclear deterrence to see if there are ways of phasing it out and replacing that with other means. That, as I mentioned, those other means should not be replacing it with other weapon systems, but finding ways of resolving the conflicts and meeting those needs in proper security ways. Thank you.
All right, let's open it up to questions from the floor.
We have some. I'll just look for hands. Please, Stefano.
The basic rule of thumb in arms control is trust but verify. How can you, in the panel, how can you imagine a situation like has been described of hyper war? You can imagine who can trust, it's easy, but how do you verify when things happen in real time? Do you have to delegate also that part to a computer or a AI? Otherwise, and we already facing this problem in cyber warfare. How can you imagine an agreement of in cyber warfare that you cannot control?
I'll pass this on, but I agree that with cyber warfare, for instance, everybody has noted how deterrence doesn't work because there's not a return address usually to deter. But it also, I think the case here is the balance between opacity and transparency. You know, how far can we go to verify before it starts to intrude on states' notions of sovereignty, but also citizens' notions of privacy? So we can throw that open if anybody has a response, or there's more of a comment, question? Yeah.
Well, if I can respond, and also in responding to Stefan, I will try to respond again to Alwyn. We all like to have, of course, a regulatory system, but in a domain or dimension like hyper warfare, where we are really at the beginning, I don't know how to think a regulatory system which can really be actually verifiable, and therefore it's a matter of trust, and that you build it through building an international system which has a great level of confidence. It is true that you have a choice, and I hope you don't believe it that we want to have as a first choice the use of force. As a matter of fact, as we liberal democrats like to say, is the last, and NATO like to say in his doctrine, is the last resort of use of force. But the point is that you want to have that last resort because the other have that last resort, and that is so. Let's go to diplomacy, but the matter of fact is that at present, the last resort, you won't have it, otherwise you don't have a choice.
Yeah, I think people would generally agree as long as we have a semi or quasi-anarchical system. And I think Clausewitz also said this, that, you know, war is going to be inevitable, but not every war is necessary. I think we can agree to that and move on. Do you want to address this?
Yeah, just sure. The trust or verify question. I think for whatever reason we've become obsessed with the attribution problem in cyber warfare, and I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is we actually got lucky with nuclear weapons. And let me make the point, because what we got lucky with is that nuclear weapons were highly technologically distinctive, meaning the character of what they're made out of is really only useful for two things: making energy or making energy really fast, meaning blowing up. There are no components or even whole systems within the entire range from quantum computing, artificial intelligence, to every other means of cyber warfare, which isn't by definition a dual-use technology. So you wouldn't even know what you needed to verify in order to take away that capability. And I think that means arms control as a paradigm is actually not very useful when we start thinking about transdimensional systems, because there is no technological distinctiveness.
Could you empower computers to control themselves?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Benjamin Bratton, who wrote a book called The Stack, which is about the geopolitics of artificial systems, said that he thought the only chance for the equivalent of arms control within artificial intelligence would be the moment which artificial intelligence would either become so diverse that it would sort of be a balancing system, or would become so intelligent that they would take away our capacity to use them. And I think short of either of those two things, arms control is not really a very useful paradigm. So basically, to quote Heidegger, right? Only a cyber god can save us now.
Yes. Oh, sure. Mark.
Just a very brief point about deterrence. Again, I mean, because of the distinctive characteristics of nuclear weaponry, we have adopted a very specific symmetrical notion. You fire a nuclear missile at me, I know it's you who fired it, and therefore I'll fire one back. That is the basic model. However, if we look at deterrence broadly, and actually the way that it operates within the penal system, if there is a crime where actually your chances of being caught are relatively limited, then actually for deterrence to work, the penalty has to be exceedingly great. So you might think, well, I've only got a 1 in 10 chance of being caught, but they lop off my hand if I get caught, rather than 9 times out of 10, I will get caught, so a fine may well prevent me from doing it. I mean, I think if deterrence is to work in this hyper-warfare age, which is difficult because since we don't even know what hyper-warfare looks like. We have a sense of certain parameters and technologies, but that's all. We're definitely going to have to uncouple ourselves from this neat notion of symmetry. You do X to me, I do X to you back. And instead it'll be a case where we may well often not know for certain who did it, but sometimes we will, or we will actually have a fairly reasonable sense from other means, and people have to know there will be terrible, terrible consequences, Trumpian raining fire down from the heavens type consequences.
Okay, I think, yes?
Thanks very much indeed, James, and thank you to all the presenters. I think what strikes me that links your presentations together is the discussion of an unprecedented range of threats, an unprecedented range of insecurities, and indeed an unprecedented range of means that we are considering to deal with them. And this discussion of politics as the continuation of war, or war as the continuation of politics by other means, raises exactly the question of whether we have the means to deal with what Jairus has called transdimensional warfare. But at the same time, we're conscious of the problems that widening this definition can bring. And Mark mentioned it as well, this chance of over-securitization. And we put ourselves back potentially into the Hobbesian situation where we create lives viewed through the security lens that are nasty, brutish, short, poor, and lonely. So how do we deal with this tension between adequately understanding the range of threats and the range of means that we need to deal with them, and this range of insecurities ranging from nuclear annihilation to personal insecurity, and how that impacts on potentially resilient or non-resilient societies, cohesive or non-cohesive societies. And there's politics at the heart of all of this. What we include in the definitions and what we exclude from, who we include and who we exclude, is going to tell us a lot about the kind of societies that we live in and the kind of societies that we want to live in. And so I think perhaps drawing that together a little bit in order to bring, for example, Saara's comments together with Giampaolo's comments and Jairus' comments, we can actually think about this politics of insecurity that is driving this discussion.
If I could, I would just like to make 2 brief points that relate to what's happened over the last couple of panels, but also yesterday. And that is, I think it was Antoine who said, that, okay, if we're going to hold on to the category of war, we should perhaps also go back and look at the juridical, I think you call it cosmopolitan laws, that could make possibly mitigation, if not an eradication of hybrid warfare. And I would like to just put on the table, one is the zone of peace, which has a legal standing. It was actually passed the General Assembly in 1972 to create a zone of peace in the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, China voted for it. Unfortunately, it was vetoed, of course, by the Soviet Union and the United States because they wanted bases, and Britain too probably did. But maybe it's time to resurrect that juridical category of a zone of peace, particularly in the region that I'm currently living in, of the South China Sea. I'm going to try to push out this as an option for some research we're doing in the future. Secondly, another point that was made, and I think it was the second panel, that the failure to preempt violence, I think 9/11 case was brought up, but also the failure, or rather the resort to violence as the first rather than the last option, isn't a lack of intelligence, but usually the absence of imagination. And I really want to thank Ben for putting this together because there's been some pretty imaginative leaps, sometimes into the void, but for the most part, I think with great, intellectual ferment, and I hope that you continue this. And to the team that put this together, I know from organizing these events myself just how much falls upon the shoulders of your team members. So I want to thank all of them. You're probably going to do the same, but as an outsider, I just wanted to offer that perspective. And of course, I want to thank all of the panelists. We want to leave a little time, I think, for Ben to make some final remarks, but this is, I think, definitely an enterprise worth investing in and continuing. So thank you very much, Ben, and the team. So. And of course, the brilliant panelists also. Thank you very, very much. And Ben, it's up to you. The floor is yours, Ben.
I would like to add my thanks to James for coming, for moderating the panel, to the panelists for a fantastic discussion that I think really did cut to the heart of some of the issues we've been talking about over the last 2 days. And I'm very gratified to hear that you indeed think what I think, which is that we have proof of concept. We have the idea that despite certain things that might get lost in translation between our different academic perspectives, between the perspectives of practitioners, policymakers, and academics and activists, we're interested in having the conversation. And we actually do want to be open to the ideas of the other in this regard. And so actually trying to create a community of discussion and dialogue in order to actually better understand our insecurities and the politics of how we deal with them is a worthwhile endeavor and a worthwhile enterprise, exactly to feed a richer group of ideas into our collective and separate imaginations of security and insecurity and the politics of doing them. I do indeed owe thanks to an awful lot of people. I owe thanks to all of the speakers who have come from as far away as Sydney and Hawaii indeed, but also from as close as our own Institute of International Relations just down there. We are extremely grateful for the cooperation and partnership that we have with the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not only for hosting this, but for financially supporting the event and for helping us promote it and providing this wonderful venue, which I think has only added to the gravitas of our discussions. To our sponsors and partners, to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, to the Institute for Democracy 21, to VR Musashi, and Mikuláš Kren and the team who have also been doing the photography and videos. Many of you have been interviewed and will be publicized around the globe as part of your participation in this first Insecurity Conference. And we've been very successful also in gathering media attention for this, so we hope that it will indeed gain traction in the wider world. Not only did we manage to get into the Politico morning playbook this morning, the Brussels edition, the BBC have been interviewing people, the Economist have been interviewing people, various aspects of the Czech media, and so this is a good way to get our ideas out into the world and get the importance of those discussions out there. So I hope, as well as them spreading the word, you will also spread the word about this conference and the value you may take from it. I also owe a supreme debt of thanks to the team that James the Derian mentioned, to Lucia Božková and Jiří Mák in particular of the conference service of the Institute of International Relations. A better team one could not ask for. This has been, in most of its inception and implementation, a three-person show. We have been greatly augmented by the wonderful team of interns, of supporters who have been managing the Twitter feed, who have been putting the water on the tables, who have been making sure the speakers get from hotels to airports, receptions, to the broad range of activities that we've had. And I would like now just to ask you to join me in thanking all of those people who have made this conference possible. The last thing I'll say is, again, thank you for helping me make what has been a long-held dream actually come true. to see critical scholars sitting together, to see James Derian sitting with Arndt von Loringhoven, the Assistant Secretary General of NATO, and the guy who broke the mold of post-structuralist IR. That is quite an achievement. To have them on the same panel as Alyn Ware, Saara Sarma, Mark Galeotti, Giampaolo di Paola, and Jairus Grove, I think, again, proof of concept. This was an interesting discussion. It's an important discussion, and it's important to include those voices and ideas that often don't get to those highest tables. And if we are indeed to think better about insecurity and war and peace, that's what we need to keep doing. The Prague Insecurity Conference will be back this time next year. Thank you all very much.